The alarm went off at 5:14 in the morning. Not 5:15. Not 5 o'clock. 5:14. That was the time Laura Bennett had set her alarm for the last 11 years, ever since her youngest son, Danny, was born premature and spent his first 3 weeks in the NICU, and she had learned, in that cold, fluorescent hospital, that the world does not wait for you to be ready. You wake up before the world does. You prepare. You carry. And you do it quietly because nobody likes a woman who makes noise about her pain. Laura reached over and turned off the alarm before it could wake her husband, Greg. She always did that. She had done it so many times that it was no longer a conscious decision. It was just something her hand did on its own, the way lungs breathe and hearts beat. Automatic. Invisible. Necessary. She sat up slowly on her side of the bed. Her side was always the left side, closer to the door, closer to the hallway, closer to the kitchen, closer to everything that needed doing. Greg slept on the right side, the window side, the side with the soft morning light. She had never once complained about that. She put her feet on the cold hardwood floor and stayed like that for a moment, just sitting, just breathing. 41 years old. Brown hair with 3 gray streaks she hadn't had time to color in 4 months. Hands that were rougher than they used to be. Eyes that were still pretty, people said, though fewer people said it these days. She stood up. The hallway was dark. She moved through it the way she always did, careful, quiet, knowing exactly where the 3rd floorboard creaked and stepping over it so she wouldn't wake anyone. She passed Danny's room first. She stopped the way she always stopped and listened. His breathing was steady, slow, the beautiful breathing of a child who had never once worried about paying a bill or making. Claude's response was interrupted. Retry humanity's dark matter warships. Shockwaves ripped through the Galactic Council. HFY Sci-Fi Story 13:21 Humanity's dark matter warships. Shockwaves RIP through the Galactic Council. A complete HFY sci-fi story in 12 parts. Genre: emotional and dramatic sci-fi. HFY Humanity, F*** yeah, ***. Narrated for YouTube storytelling, 75 minutes read time. Part 1. The species that was never supposed to survive. The Galactic Council had existed for 400,000 years. That was not a metaphor. That was not an exaggeration designed to make lesser species feel small, though it accomplished that quite efficiently. 400,000 years of recorded interstellar history, 400,000 years of wars negotiated and borders drawn and treaties signed in chambers so vast that entire human cities could have fit inside their meeting halls. 400,000 years of order, of hierarchy, of a universe that knew its place and stayed in it. And then there was Earth. Earth was not supposed to matter. That was the thing that the history books, the real history books, the ones written by the Velthari and the Sankai and the ancient Drexy archive keepers, would never quite be able to explain properly. Because by every measurable standard, by every projection model and biological assessment and resource calculation that the Council's most sophisticated minds had run across 3 separate centuries of observation, humanity was not supposed to survive long enough to become a problem. They were too soft, too divided, too emotionally volatile, too dependent on a single fragile star orbiting in a quiet corner of a mid-sized spiral galaxy that nobody particularly cared about. Their biology was laughably vulnerable. No natural armor, no regenerative tissue beyond the most basic cellular repair, no electromagnetic sense, no secondary respiratory system, no ability to survive even moderate vacuum exposure for more than a few seconds. They got sick from microscopic organisms. They broke bones falling from heights that a Velthari child would consider a minor inconvenience. They needed to sleep, actually sleep, unconscious and vulnerable, for nearly a third of every single day of their lives. And yet here they were. Commander Sarah Cole stood at the viewport of the USHV Unbroken, the flagship of the United Sol Fleet's 7th Dark Matter Division, and looked out at the stars. She was 38 years old. She had brown eyes and dark skin and close-cropped natural hair that she kept neat under her command cap, and she had a small scar above her left eyebrow from a training accident at the Naval Academy on Titan when she was 19 years old. She was not a particularly large woman. She was not physically intimidating in any way that an alien species would recognize on first contact. But she commanded a warship that was 3 kilometers long, powered by a dark matter compression core that could generate more raw energy in 30 seconds than the entire combined output of Earth's pre-industrial civilization over 5,000 years, and armed with 12 primary dark matter lances that could punch a hole through the crust of a moon. And she was in a very bad mood. "Tell me again," she said, her voice calm, her hands clasped behind her back. "Tell me what they said." "Exactly what they said. Word for word, Lieutenant." Lieutenant James Okafor, her communications officer, was 26 years old, long and lean, with nervous hands that he was currently doing an excellent job of keeping still. He had worked with Commander Cole for 2 years. He knew her moods. He knew the specific texture of the calm voice and what it meant. "The Velthari ambassador, Commander," he said carefully. "During the emergency session of the Galactic Council, 3 hours ago," he said, and I'm quoting directly from the translation matrix, "that humanity's development of dark matter propulsion and weaponization technology constitutes, and I quote, a fundamental violation of the natural developmental order, and that the Council formally requests that all human dark matter assets be submitted for collective governance under Council authority within 30 standard cycles." Sarah did not move. "He said," she repeated slowly, "that we need to hand over our ships." "Yes, Commander. Our ships. That we built. With our technology. That we developed. In our own facilities. On our own time. With our own resources." "Yes, Commander. The ships that we needed," she continued, her voice still perfectly level, "because 6 years ago when the Keth Dominion decided that the Sol system was an unclaimed resource zone and sent a harvest fleet to strip mine our asteroid belt and our gas giants, the Galactic Council formally declined to intervene because, and I believe I'm also quoting here, Earth was a pre-contact civilization and therefore not a protected member of Council jurisdiction." James Okafor said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Because she was exactly right and they both knew it and every human being alive knew it, and it was the wound that had never healed and never would. 6 years ago. The Keth Dominion Harvest Fleet. The thing that changed everything. You had to understand what happened 6 years ago to understand why the Galactic Council was afraid now. You had to understand it completely without the sanitized version that the Council's diplomatic channels tried to distribute, without the carefully worded statements about tragic miscommunication and jurisdictional ambiguity and collective regret for unintended consequences. You had to understand what actually happened. In the year 2157, humanity had achieved a functional interstellar presence. Not a grand one. Nothing like the sweeping starfaring civilization of science fiction dreams. But real. Practical. Human beings lived and worked on Mars, on several Jovian moons, in deep space stations at the Lagrange points, and in a handful of slow-moving colony ships making their way toward Proxima Centauri and Alpha Centauri on journeys that would take their grandchildren to complete. Earth's population was 11 billion. The solar system had been mapped, partially developed, partially settled. Humanity was, by any reasonable measure, doing reasonably well. They had also, as it happened, been observed by the Galactic Council for approximately 200 years at that point, quietly, passively, from a distance, the way you might watch an interesting insect from the other side of a glass wall. The Council had a protocol for emerging civilizations. Every species went through a developmental assessment period. You were watched. You were catalogued. Your biology, your technology, your social structures, your conflict patterns, your resource usage, all of it was noted, analyzed, filed in the Great Archives. And then, when you reached what the Council defined as contact readiness, a specific combination of technological capability, social stability, and demonstrated capacity for interstellar communication, you were formally introduced to the galactic community. Humanity was, according to the Council's most recent assessment, approximately 40 to 60 years from contact readiness. Which meant that when the Keth Dominion submitted a resource claim on the Sol system, the Council's response was technically, bureaucratically, agonizingly correct. Earth was pre-contact. Earth was not a member civilization. Earth's solar system, by Council law, existed in an unprotected developmental zone. The Keth Dominion's claim was filed properly. The processing fee was paid. The extraction rights were granted. Nobody told Earth. Why would they? Earth couldn't hear them yet. The Keth Dominion Harvest Fleet arrived on a Tuesday. 18 ships, each one roughly the size of Manhattan, appearing in the outer solar system with no warning, because they had no obligation to warn anyone, and immediately beginning the systematic extraction of hydrogen, helium-3 and trace exotic elements from Jupiter's upper atmosphere. Earth's deep space monitoring arrays detected them within 6 hours. The panic that followed was unlike anything in human history. Every government on Earth was on emergency alert within 24 hours. Every space agency. Every military. Every scientist who had ever worked on SETI spent those first 72 hours staring at their instruments with shaking hands. The Keth didn't attack. They didn't even acknowledge Earth directly. They were not there for Earth, not yet. They were there for the gas giants. Earth itself was too resource poor to be worth the extraction cost. The Keth were efficient. They took what was valuable and ignored what was not. But they did, In the third week of their operation, when a human deep space mining platform near Ganymede attempted to make radio contact, send a response. One response. Translated later, it said, "This zone is under active extraction claim. Organic presence noted. Extraction operations will avoid direct biological contact zones where efficient. No further communication necessary." That was it. We're efficient. We're efficient. Not we won't hurt you. Not we acknowledge your civilization. Not even a name. Just, we're efficient. As if the 11 billion human beings living in the solar system were a minor logistical note. A herd of deer in a forest that was being logged. Something to route around when convenient. Earth's governments did everything they could. They sent transmissions. They sent probes. They mobilized every military asset in the solar system. And those assets were real because humanity had not spent its history without learning the value of weapons, and pointed them at the Keth fleet in what they hoped read as a clear deterrent signal. The Keth responded to the military mobilization the way a person responds to a mosquito in a dark room. Not with aggression. Not with negotiation. With mild, barely registered irritation. And then they swatted. Not with their full force. Not even close. One Keth ship, 1 out of 18, peeled away from the Jupiter extraction operation and discharged what their technology classified as a perimeter enforcement pulse. A deterrent measure. A warning shot at industrial scale. It disabled every human military asset in the outer solar system in 11 seconds. Satellites went dark. Deep space stations went to emergency power. The 3 human warships that Earth's combined space forces had managed to get to the outer system went completely offline, drifting. Nobody died. The Keth were not interested in killing. Killing was complicated. Killing brought consequences. They had simply demonstrated, with the patience of a civilization that had been doing this for 6,000 years, that human military capability was not a relevant variable in their calculations. And then they went back to mining Jupiter. Earth's governments called the Galactic Council. It took them 3 days to figure out how to reach the Council, because they had not been told the Council existed. It took another 2 days for the Council's communications relay to acknowledge the signal. It took 4 more days for a Council representative, not an ambassador, not a senior official, but a mid-level administrative coordinator, to respond. The coordinator expressed the Council's sympathy. The coordinator explained the jurisdictional situation. The coordinator noted that while the Council understood the distress of the Sol system's biological inhabitants, the Keth Dominion's claim was legally valid under current Council charter. The coordinator suggested that humanity might wish to formally apply for Council membership, which would take an estimated 40 to 60 years to process given current developmental assessments. The coordinator was very polite, very professional, very apologetic in the way that people are apologetic when they don't actually feel responsible for anything. 3 more months passed. The Keth finished with Jupiter and moved to Saturn. Saturn's rings, it turned out, contained several exotic element deposits that were extraordinarily valuable. The extraction operation grew. More Keth ships arrived. And then something happened that nobody, not the Keth, not the Council, not a single one of the 412 member civilizations of the Galactic Council, had predicted. Humanity got angry. Not the panic angry of the first weeks. Not the desperate angry of the diplomatic failures. Something older and colder and more dangerous than that. The kind of angry that comes from a species that has been fighting for survival since before it had language, that has buried its dead and rebuilt its cities and come back from every disaster its own planet threw at it for 300,000 years. The kind of angry that does not ask for help. The kind of angry that builds. Dr. Marcus Webb was 44 years old when the Keth arrived. He was a theoretical physicist at MIT's Advanced Propulsion Lab, a quiet man with reading glasses and a habit of forgetting to eat lunch when he was deep in a problem. He had published 31 papers on dark matter field dynamics, 23 of which had been considered too theoretical to be practically relevant by every funding committee he had ever presented to. He watched the Keth extract Saturn's rings on a screen in his lab, and he did not panic and he did not despair. He went back to his papers. Because here was the thing about dark matter that Marcus Webb understood better than almost anyone alive. It was everywhere. It made up approximately 27% of the mass energy content of the observable universe. It was, in terms of sheer abundance, the single most plentiful substance in existence. And yet nobody, not humans, not the Keth, not the Velthari or the Sankai or any of the 412 member civilizations of the Galactic Council, had ever successfully harnessed it directly. They harnessed dark matter's effects. They mapped its distribution. They used its gravitational influence for navigation. The most advanced Council civilizations used dark matter density variations for passive energy collection, the way a sailboat uses wind. Nobody had ever grabbed dark matter by the throat and told it what to do. Marcus Webb thought he knew why. And more importantly, he thought he knew how to fix it. He called his graduate student, a brilliant young woman named Dr. Priya Anand, into his office on the morning of the Keth Fleet's 7th week in the solar system, and he put 31 papers on the desk in front of her, and he said, "I need you to tell me if I'm wrong. I need you to try as hard as you possibly can to tell me I'm wrong. Because if I'm right, we need to move very fast and I need to be completely certain before we move." Priya Anand was 29 years old, the daughter of Indian immigrants, raised in Chicago, the kind of person who had wanted to understand the universe since she was 7 years old, and her father showed her Saturn through a backyard telescope and told her that the rings were made of ice and rock and that nobody really knew why they were so perfectly flat. She read Marcus Webb's 31 papers in one sitting. Then she sat quietly for a very long time. Then she said, "You're not wrong, Marcus? You're sure?" "I've been trying to find the error for the last 4 hours," she said. "There isn't one. The compression field dynamics in section 6. I thought that was the weak point. But the math holds. The math holds all the way through." Marcus took off his glasses and rubbed his face. "How long?" he said. "Realistic estimate. Not optimistic. Realistic." Priya looked at the ceiling for a moment. "If we had unlimited funding and the entire global research community," she said, "and we started tomorrow?" "Yes." 3 years, she said. "Maybe 2.5 if we're very lucky and nothing goes wrong. And if the Keth are still here in 3 years? Then we'll have to work faster," she said simply. Marcus Webb picked up his phone and called the President of the United States. He had never called a president before. He did not have the number. It took him 45 minutes to reach someone who could connect him to someone who could connect him to someone who mattered. It took him 11 minutes to explain what he had found. It took the president 48 hours to assemble a coalition that included 37 national governments, every major space agency, every defense contractor on Earth, and a research budget that dwarfed anything in human history. And then humanity started building. Commander Sarah Cole had been 22 years old when the Keth came. She had been a second-year cadet at the Naval Academy, studying aerospace combat systems, not because she had any particular expectation of ever using them in a real space war, but because she was the kind of person who took the hardest path available and trusted that it would lead somewhere worth going. She remembered watching the Keth ships on the news feeds. She remembered the way her instructors, hardened military people, people who had spent their careers preparing for threats, looked when they thought no one was watching them. Not angry. Not resolved. Afraid. Actually afraid, in a way that she had never seen in them before, because they were people who had trained for human threats, for known threats, for threats that fit inside the framework of things they understood. And the Keth were not that. She had made a decision in that moment that she had never regretted, not once in the 16 years since. She had looked at the Keth ships on the screen and she had looked at her own hands and she had thought, somebody is going to fix this. Not the Council, who had already failed them. Not diplomacy, which had already been tried. Somebody was going to build something and learn something and fight back, not out of revenge but out of the oldest and most human of all instincts, the absolute, unshakable refusal to accept that this was simply how things were. And she had decided, at 22 years old, sitting in a classroom at the Naval Academy while the Keth mined Saturn's rings, that she was going to be part of that somebody. She had no idea at the time that she would end up commanding the ship that changed everything. But that was 16 years away. First, humanity had to learn how to be angry in a way that actually mattered. The project had no official public name for the first 18 months. Internally, the multinational research coalition called it Project Keystone. The press, when they inevitably found out that something large was happening, called it various things: the Manhattan Project of Space, the Emergency Propulsion Initiative, the Webb-Anand program after its 2 founding scientists. The military called it, with characteristic directness, the Dark Arsenal. The Keth called it nothing because they didn't know it existed. That was, in retrospect, the single greatest strategic advantage humanity had ever possessed. The Keth Dominion was 6,000 years old. It had absorbed and dominated and occasionally exterminated hundreds of smaller civilizations across its long history. It knew exactly what a pre-contact species looked like when it was afraid, and it knew exactly what a pre-contact species was capable of when cornered, and it had built its entire operational doctrine around the comfortable certainty that there was a ceiling to what young species could do. The ceiling, in the Keth's experience, was always well below the threshold of actual threat. They were used to species that built better conventional weapons in response to first contact. Bigger missiles. More powerful railguns. Improved shielding. The technological equivalent of sharpening a stick to fight a tank. They had seen it dozens of times. It was sad, in the way that watching any doomed effort was sad, and it was also completely irrelevant to their operations because conventional weapons, kinetic weapons, electromagnetic weapons, nuclear weapons, operated within physical parameters that the Keth had long since rendered obsolete. What they had never seen, what no civilization in the Galactic Council had ever seen, was a species that refused to sharpen its stick. A species that looked at the tank and decided, in a cold fury, to build a better tank. The first breakthrough came 14 months into Project Keystone, in a research facility built deep under the Swiss Alps, in tunnels that had originally been dug for particle accelerator experiments. Dr. Webb's compression field dynamics, the core theoretical framework from his 31 papers, turned out to be correct in all the ways that mattered and wrong in one specific way that turned out to be, paradoxically, even better than what he had intended. The error was Priya Anand's discovery at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, when she had been awake for 31 hours and was running on her fourth coffee and the specific kind of brain state that comes from sustained exhaustion mixed with absolute focus. She was working on the containment equations, the mathematical framework for holding a dark matter compression field stable long enough to be useful, when she noticed something strange. In the model she was running, the compressed dark matter field didn't just hold its shape under the parameters she had set. Under a specific threshold of compression, at a precise energy input ratio that she had accidentally set incorrectly due to a transcription error from her notes, the field didn't hold. It collapsed. But not the way a failed containment field normally collapsed. Not chaotically, not with energy scattering in all directions. It collapsed in a single direction. Precisely. Sharply. With a focused release of energy that the sensors measuring her model could barely register because the release happened so fast and so cleanly that it exceeded their measurement parameters. She sat and stared at the result for a long time. Then she ran it again deliberately with the same incorrect parameters. Same result. She ran it 47 more times with every variation she could think of, changing every variable except the core compression collapse dynamic. Same result, every time. Slight variations in magnitude. Consistent direction. Consistent focus. At 6 a.m. she woke up Marcus Webb with a phone call. "I found something," she said. "You need to come in." "Is it good or bad?" he said, groggy. "Marcus," she said. "I think I found a gun." The dark matter lance, that was what the engineers eventually called it, though the theoretical physicists preferred directed dark matter collapse emitter, which was accurate and also completely unpronounceably dull, worked on a principle that took 6 months to fully understand and another 8 months to engineer into a functional prototype. The basic concept, dark matter under extreme compression, could be induced to undergo a directed gravitational collapse event. Not a true singularity, not a black hole, nothing that catastrophic. But a focused collapse along a single vector, releasing a burst of gravitational energy so concentrated and directional that it behaved, from a practical standpoint, exactly like a weapon. What it hit, it crushed. Not with heat. Not with radiation. Not with kinetic force in any conventional sense. With gravity. Localized, focused, blindingly brief. A pulse that lasted less than a millisecond. But in that millisecond, the gravitational gradient at the point of impact was equivalent to the surface of a neutron star. The first prototype was tested on an asteroid in the outer belt, designated Test Object 7, a nickel-iron rock approximately 600 meters across. The lance fired. The pulse took 11 milliseconds to reach Test Object 7 at the test range they had established. Test Object 7 stopped existing. Not exploded. Not shattered. Stopped existing. The asteroid was there, and then it was an expanding cloud of dust and iron vapor and nothing else, a sphere of debris spreading outward from a point where a 600-meter rock had been 1 second before. The observation team in the monitoring station watched this happen in complete silence for approximately 10 seconds. Then someone in the back of the room, a young engineer from South Korea named Park Jin-ho, who had been working on the project for 8 months and was 24 years old and had never in his life done anything more dramatic than win a robotics competition, stood up and said very quietly, "Oh. Just that. Just oh. Because what else do you say when you watch physics do something you've spent your whole life being told it couldn't do?" Marcus Webb, standing at the front of the observation room with Priya Anand beside him, watched the debris cloud expand on the sensor feed. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them carefully with his shirt hem. He put them back on. "Again," he said. "We're going to need to do that again. Many more times. And then we're going to need to make it smaller and then we're going to need to make it much, much bigger." The second major breakthrough, the one that made the lance a weapon rather than a laboratory curiosity, was dark matter propulsion. A warship that could shoot gravitational pulses but couldn't move faster than conventional drives was a fortress, not a fleet. And a fortress only works if the enemy comes to you. Dark matter propulsion turned out to follow naturally from the same compression dynamics as the Lance, with one key difference. Instead of inducing a directional collapse, you induced a directional expansion. A controlled, sustained dark matter field expansion in the opposite direction of travel, creating what amounted to a gravitational gradient you could surf. You pushed the field behind you, and the gradient between the expanded field and normal space pulled your ship forward. The theoretical speed ceiling was something that made the physicists quiet when they calculated it. It wasn't faster than light, the physics didn't allow that, and Marcus Webb was not a man who argued with the physics. But it was fast enough. Orders of magnitude faster than any conventional human drive. Fast enough to cross the solar system in hours instead of months. Fast enough, potentially, to reach neighboring star systems in weeks rather than decades. The engineers built the first prototype drive into a hull the size of a container ship. They called the ship the Experiment. They were not, as a group, a particularly creative naming committee. The first test of the dark matter drive happened 2 years after Project Keystone began. The experiment started at Earth orbit, pointed at a beacon they had placed near Neptune, and fired the drive. It crossed the distance in 4 hours and 17 minutes. No human ship had ever done anything like that. The crew, all volunteers, all fully aware that they might not come back, all deeply, quietly heroic in the way that people who do dangerous things for good reasons are heroic without fanfare. The crew of the experiment were waiting at the Neptune beacon when the monitoring teams finally stopped cheering. Their pilot, a former Navy test pilot named Captain James Roy, sent back a very short message. It said, "Request permission to come home. Drive is nominal. Ship is nominal. Crew is nominal. Also, we are all crying a little bit and wanted you to know that." The Keth Dominion completed its extraction of Saturn's ring system in the 3rd year and began surveying the asteroid belt for additional deposits. They had been in the solar system for 38 months. They had never once looked at Earth as a meaningful concern. That was the last year that would be true. They built the ships in secret. Not in space. Not at first, not where Keth passive sensors might detect the energy signatures of construction. They built the components on Earth in facilities distributed across 6 continents, divided into pieces small enough and energy passive enough to look like ordinary industrial manufacturing. They built hull sections in shipyards in the Pacific Northwest and component manufacturing plants in Japan and propulsion core assembly facilities in Germany and Brazil and South Africa. They built weapons systems and underground facilities in Nevada and Mongolia and deep beneath the Australian outback. And then, when the components were ready, they moved them. Slowly. Carefully. In the shadow of Earth's electromagnetic noise, using every passive transport method available. They moved them to the far side of the moon, where Earth's bulk served as a shield from any casual observation, and they assembled them there, in the cold lunar dark, in facilities carved out of the lunar crust by robots and worked by humans in pressure suits, working in shifts, sleeping in cramped quarters blasted out of the rock. The first ship, the Unbroken, took 14 months to assemble. The second ship, the Steadfast, took 9. The 3rd through 8th ships took 6 months each. By the time they launched the 12th and final ship of the initial fleet, the Long Memory, named by popular vote from a list submitted by schoolchildren around the world, the entire building program had taken 4 years, 8 months and 11 days. During those 4 years, 8 months and 11 days, the Keth Dominion had extracted approximately 40% of Jupiter's accessible hydrogen deposits, all of Saturn's ring material, and a significant portion of the outer asteroid belt's exotic element deposits. They had not attacked Earth directly, not once. They had not communicated with Earth directly, not once, beyond that initial response. Where efficient, no further communication necessary. They had simply taken what they came for. Professionally. Methodically. Without malice and without care. It was the without care that did it in the end. Humanity had survived malice before. Malice you can fight, negotiate with, appeal to. Malice sees you. Malice acknowledges your existence even while trying to end it. The Keth's indifference was different. The Keth's indifference said, "You do not matter enough to hate. You do not matter enough to fear. You are an obstacle in the way of our efficiency, and we will route around you where convenient, and if you stop being convenient to route around, we will address that too, and you will have no more significance in either case than a hill of ants in the path of a highway." And humanity, who had spent its entire history matching to each other, who had built entire religions and civilizations and art forms around the idea that individual lives and collective dignity had weight, had significance, meant something, humanity found that particular flavor of dismissal to be utterly, completely, catastrophically intolerable. Commander Sarah Cole was assigned to the Unbroken 3 years into its construction, when the ship was still a skeleton of hull frames and half-assembled corridors on the far side of the moon. She was 32 years old, a commander, combat qualified on 3 different conventional weapon systems, with a service record that had accumulated a quiet collection of commendations for actions that never made the news because space operations didn't make the news the way terrestrial operations did. She came to the Unbroken on the recommendation of Admiral Diana Torres, who was 60 years old and had been the head of the Dark Arsenal's fleet development program since year 1. Torres was a small woman who wore her gray hair in a severe bun and had a voice that could cut glass, and she had a specific way of evaluating officers that she had developed over 30 years of naval service. She put them in a room and she gave them a scenario, a crisis, a tactical situation, a command decision with no good options, and she watched not just what they decided but how they decided it. She watched the faces, the breathing, the moment of hesitation or its absence, the quality of the first question they asked. With Sarah Cole, she had given a scenario where a ship with a crew of 400 was facing a weapons malfunction that had a 60% chance of destroying the ship and a 40% chance of being fixed in time, but fixing it required sending a repair team of 12 into a section of the ship that had a 90% chance of killing them all in the process. Sarah Cole had been quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she had said, "I need the repair team to volunteer. I need them to know the real numbers. And I need to be in the repair team." "You're the commander," Admiral Torres had said. "You can't." "If I'm asking 12 people to go into a 90% death zone," Sarah Cole had said, "I go with them. That's not heroics. That's arithmetic. They're not going to die so that I can live to command a dead ship." Torres had looked at her for a long time. Then she had said, "Report to the Unbroken assembly facility on Monday." The crew of the Unbroken was 437 people when they launched. They came from 41 countries. Their average age was 29. A significant number of them had been children when the Keth arrived, and they carried that in them the way people carry childhood things, deep and structural, part of the foundation of who they were. The chief engineer was a woman named Rosa Martinez, 34, originally from Guadalajara, who had gotten her engineering doctorate at UNAM and then spent 6 years working on the dark matter drive prototypes before being assigned to the Unbroken. She talked to the ship's drive core the way some people talk to plants or pets, quietly, constantly, with an affection that she would have found difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't spent years nursing complex machinery into reliability. The tactical officer was a man named Lieutenant Commander Ben Holt, 31, from Denver, who had the specific gift of being able to hold 17 different scenarios in his head simultaneously and evaluate their relative probabilities without writing anything down. He also made excellent coffee and had strong opinions about chess, both of which made him universally popular on long-duration space missions. The medical officer was Dr. Amara Osei, 36, originally from Accra, Ghana, who had a practice in practical xenobiology that she had developed on the theory that when humanity eventually made contact with other species, someone was going to need to understand the biology. She had not anticipated that contact being what it turned out to be. She was the calmest person on the ship by most measures, which was useful. The navigator was Ensign Tyler Brooks, 24, from Portland, the youngest commissioned officer on the Unbroken, recruited directly from the Naval Academy's Advanced Dark Matter Propulsion Program. He had grown up watching news feeds of the Keth ships mining Saturn and had made his career decision at 14 with the same quiet certainty that Sarah Cole had made hers at 22. These were the people who, on a cold morning in March of 2162, brought the Unbroken to life. The ship lit up in the dark of the Farside lunar base, systems coming online one by one, power core, life support, propulsion, weapons, navigation, and the entire facility crew, 3,000 people who had spent years building this ship and living under the shadow of the Keth's presence in their solar system, watched the Unbroken run its first full systems check. Everything was nominal. Sarah Cole stood on the bridge of her ship, looking at the stars through the viewport, and felt something she had not felt since she was 22 years old. She felt like the odds might be changing. They did not launch immediately. There was a plan. The plan was important. The plan had been developed over 4 years by a committee that included Admiral Torres, Marcus Webb, Priya Anand, now Dr. Anand, and the co-director of the entire dark matter weapons program, and 30 other scientists, tacticians, intelligence analysts, and diplomatic strategists. The plan had been argued over and revised and refined and tested in simulations so detailed that they ran on the most powerful computers humanity had ever built. The plan had 3 components. The first component was what they called the demonstration. 1 ship. 1 action. Clear, deliberate, Impossible to misinterpret. Not an attack on the Keth fleet directly, not at first. Something that said with mathematical precision, "We see you. We have built something you did not expect." The rules of this situation have changed. The second component was communication. Simultaneous with the demonstration, Earth would broadcast on every council frequency, in every council-recognized translation protocol, a formal notice to the Galactic Council and the Keth Dominion, that humanity was filing for emergency contact status, that the dark matter fleet existed and was operational, and that Earth was requesting the immediate withdrawal of the Keth Dominion from the Sol system. Not demanding. Requesting. There was a difference, and the diplomatic team had argued about it for 3 weeks before settling on the word. The third component was readiness. The remaining 11 ships, fully armed, on standby. Because everyone involved understood that the demonstration and the communication might not be enough. And if they weren't enough, then the third component was what happened next. Sarah Cole had read the plan 40 times. She agreed with it. She had contributed to it. And she understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who had spent her adult life in military service, that the third component was the one that kept her up at night. Not because she feared it, but because if it came to that, if the demonstration wasn't enough, if the Keth decided to respond with force, then humanity was about to find out whether the ships they had built in secret, with technology they had developed in isolation, were actually good enough. There was only one way to find out. She hoped, very sincerely, that the demonstration would be enough. The target was a Keth automated extraction drone, one of hundreds that the Dominion had seeded through the asteroid belt, each one approximately the size of a building, armored, self-repairing, broadcasting continuous operational data back to the Keth fleet. The extraction drones were, in many ways, the most insulting aspect of the Keth operation because they were completely automated. The Keth didn't need to be physically present to strip mine a solar system. They could do it remotely. They could send the drones in, set them working, and check back occasionally to collect the output. The entire extraction of humanity's solar system, the theft of resources from the home system of 11 billion people, was being conducted with approximately the same level of personal attention that someone gives to a dishwasher running in another room. The Unbroken came out of dark matter drive transit 7,000 kilometers from drone station KD-7, designated so in Keth operational records but known to the human intelligence team, who had been monitoring Keth communications since month 1 with increasingly sophisticated translation algorithms, as the largest single extraction unit in the asteroid belt operation. 7,000 kilometers. Close enough to be unambiguous. Far enough to be clear that this was deliberate approach, not an accident. Sarah Cole stood at the center of the bridge. The bridge of the Unbroken was designed around a central command platform with full holographic displays, not the science fiction kind, not solid-looking holograms, but functional data displays projected in 3 dimensions, showing tactical positioning, ship status, sensor readings. Around her, her crew moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had trained for this specific moment for years. Broadcast on all Keth operational frequencies, she said. Standard translation matrix. I want them to understand every word. Broadcasting, Commander, James Okafor confirmed. She took a breath. Keth Dominion Drone Station KD-7, she said, her voice steady, the voice of someone who had decided years ago how this moment was going to sound. This is Commander Sarah Cole of the United Sol Fleet vessel Unbroken. We are transmitting this message simultaneously to the Keth Dominion Fleet Command, to the Galactic Council Emergency Channel, and to a public broadcast on Earth. In approximately 60 seconds, we will demonstrate the capability of dark matter lance weapons technology developed by humanity in response to the unauthorized extraction operation currently being conducted in the Sol system. This demonstration targets Drone Station KD-7. No biological beings are present at this location. This is a demonstration, not an attack. It is a statement of capability and a request for negotiation. We request the Keth Dominion fleet stand down and make no aggressive response. We are prepared to discuss terms for the cessation of extraction activities and the restoration of Sol system resource integrity. 60 seconds. She released the broadcast. Lieutenant Holt, she said. Targeting is locked, Commander, Ben Holt said from the tactical station. His voice was completely level. She appreciated that about him. Weapons hot. Dark matter lance, primary array. Charged and ready. The Council channel? She asked Okafor. Live, Commander. They're receiving. Good, she said. I want them to see this too. She looked at the forward display where the asteroid belt stretched in all its ancient, indifferent beauty, and where drone station KD-7 sat like a mechanical tumor in the middle of it, grinding through resources that had orbited this sun for 4.5 billion years. Fire, she said. The dark matter lance discharged. The Unbroken shuddered slightly, not from recoil, there was no conventional recoil, but from the energy draw of the weapon system, a brief system-wide dimming that Rosa Martinez had been anticipating and had already compensated for. The pulse crossed 7,000 kilometers in just under 0.03 seconds. KD-7, a structure the size of a large building, armored with Keth military-grade composite alloys that had stopped conventional weapons fire from a dozen different species over the centuries, was there, and then, after a brief delay while the sensor data processed, it was not destroyed, not damaged, not cracked open or blasted apart. Gone. A cloud of metallic vapor and structural fragments expanding outward from a point in space where a Keth extraction drone had been. The bridge of the Unbroken was absolutely silent for 3 full seconds. Then someone in the back, Tyler Brooks, the youngest officer on the ship, the navigator who had made his career decision at 14 while watching news feeds of Saturn being strip-mined, said very quietly with a voice that was doing its best to stay professional, "Oh, Caro." Several crew members laughed. Nervous, release valve laughter, the kind that happens when adrenaline needs somewhere to go. Sarah Cole permitted herself a very small smile. Then she put it away. "Status on Keth fleet response," she said. "Monitoring their tactical frequencies," Okafor said. "There is definitely activity. I'm reading increased power signatures from 3 of their primary extraction vessels. They're aware." "Good," Sarah Cole said. "Let them be aware. Open a direct channel to Keth Fleet Command." "Channel open." "Keth Dominion Fleet Command," she said. "This is Commander Cole of the Unbroken. The demonstration is complete. We are holding position and awaiting your response. We strongly encourage a response of the non-aggressive variety. We are prepared to discuss the terms of your withdrawal from the Sol system. We have 11 additional vessels of equivalent or greater capability to the Unbroken on standby at various positions throughout the system. We are not looking for a fight. But HFY, from this moment forward, we are not something you can choose not to look at. We exist. We are armed. And we are done being treated like an inconvenience. Your response, please." She sat down in the command chair. They waited. The response came in 17 minutes. Not from the Keth fleet. Not directly. From the Galactic Council. The Council's emergency channel opened, a channel that had been broadcasting the entire demonstration to every member civilization's monitoring systems, and a voice came through. Not the mid-level administrative coordinator who had spoken to Earth 5 years ago. Not a regional representative. The Council speaker herself. High Chancellor Vara of the Velthari, the highest authority in the Galactic Council, a being who was 230 years old and had presided over the Council for 40 of them, and who had, by all accounts, not spoken on an emergency channel in personal response to a situation in 11 years. High Chancellor Vara's voice, through the translation matrix, was low and measured and carried a quality that the translation algorithm rendered as carefully controlled alarm. "This is High Chancellor Vara of the Galactic Council, speaking to the Sol System vessel Unbroken and to all monitoring parties. We acknowledge receipt of your demonstration and your transmission. The Council is convening an emergency session immediately. We strongly urge all parties to maintain current positions and take no further unilateral action pending Council deliberation. Commander Cole, you and your people have our full attention." Sarah Cole looked at James Okafor, who looked back at her with an expression that said, very clearly, "We have their full attention." Like they were surprised. Like this wasn't what they expected. "Acknowledge the Council," she said. "Tell them we appreciate their attention and will hold position for 24 hours pending the emergency session. And get me Admiral Torres." Torres came on secure channel within 2 minutes. "I saw it," Torres said without preamble. "The Council response?" "Vara herself," Sarah confirmed. Pause. "Then it worked." "The demonstration worked," Sarah said carefully. "The Keth haven't responded yet." "They will," Torres said. "I know." Another pause. "Are you ready for when they do?" Sarah looked at the forward display at the stars at the spot in the asteroid belt where drone station KD-7 used to be. "HFY," she said, and those words meant something, carried weight, spoken in the language of everything they had built and everyone who had built it and everyone who had lived under the shadow of a species that had decided they weren't worth acknowledging. "From this moment forward." "Yes, Admiral. We're ready." Part 5. The Council in Chaos. The Galactic Council's emergency session was held in the Grand Chamber of Velthar Prime, in a hall that had been constructed 400,000 years ago by a civilization so ancient that their architecture had become, over the millennia, indistinguishable from geology. The walls were grown crystal, slow-formed over tens of thousands of years, shot through with bioluminescent veins that pulsed in patterns that had meaning in the Velthari language, a language so old that most of its speakers were themselves ancient by any other species measure. 412 seats. 412 member civilizations, each represented by an ambassador, each ambassador a being of considerable importance in their home civilization, each one currently doing some version of what might be recognizable, across all species lines, as a very significant amount of internal distress. They had watched the demonstration. All of them. Live on council broadcast because that was what Commander Cole had intended, not just to show the Keth, not just to announce to Earth but to show everyone. To put humanity's capability in front of every civilization in the galaxy simultaneously, because the politics of what came next depended entirely on who saw what and when. Ambassador Grethvaz of the Keth Dominion was the fourth largest being in the room. The Keth were a physically impressive species by most standards, broad and heavily plated, with a posture that conveyed, in Keth body language, something between discomfort and suppressed anger. He had been trying to reach Keth Dominion Fleet Command since the demonstration happened and had, thus far, received only automated acknowledgement signals. His fleet was deliberating. That was, itself, significant. Ambassador San of the Sankai, the second oldest member civilization in the Council, a species of silicon-based beings who communicated in precise harmonic frequencies and who were, by any measure, the Council's foremost weapons theorists, sat in their seat and radiated what their species' postures conveyed as deep, focused attention. The Sankai had been monitoring humanity's solar system for longer than any other Council species. They had, in fact, been the ones who had originally flagged Earth as an interesting developmental case in the broader Council surveillance database, 300 years ago. They had not, in 300 years of observation, predicted this. That was unusual for the Sankai. They were not accustomed to being surprised. Ambassador Draxianen of the Draxi Collective, one of the oldest Council members, a species that had been part of the Council since before the Velthari gained their current dominance, sat in their seat and said nothing at all in any channel, which was, for the Draxi who were ordinarily among the most communicative beings in the chamber, extremely significant. High Chancellor Vara stood at the center of the chamber and looked at 412 representatives of 412 civilizations and felt something she had not felt in 40 years of leading this body. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. The kind that comes not from not knowing what will happen, but from suddenly realizing that the category of things that can happen is larger than you thought it was. The Council will come to order, she said. It took longer than usual. The debate that followed was one for the historical record. And it was in the historical record because every second of every Council session was archived in the Velthari Central Memory, the most comprehensive database of galactic civilization in existence. The first to speak after the Chancellor established order was Ambassador Mora of the Philindri Consortium, a mid-tier civilization, 12-star systems, known for their role as traders and information brokers. The Philindri were small, quick-moving beings who expressed opinions in rapid-fire bursts, and Mora's burst was the galactic equivalent of someone slamming their hand on a table. We need to address the violation, Mora said. The humans, species designation Sol 3 pre-contact classification as of 3 solar cycles ago, have developed and deployed technology that falls under the Council's Category 3 restricted development protocols. Dark matter weaponization. This is not ambiguous. This is a violation of. On what basis, said Ambassador Draxianen, speaking for the first time, is the restricted development protocol relevant to a species that was not informed the protocol existed? Silence. The protocol applies to all species in Council observable developmental zones, Mora pressed. The protocol, Draxianen said, with the measured precision of a being who had been in this chamber for 200 years, assumes that species in developmental zones are made aware of the Council's existence and its rules. Sol 3 was not informed of either. They were, under our own charter, kept in deliberate observational isolation. And during that isolation, a Council member, the Keth Dominion, conducted an extraction operation in their home system. With our approval. The chamber was very quiet. Caro, said the ambassador of the Yan hegemony in their own language, and while the translation matrix rendered it only as a nonverbal expression of something like stunned acknowledgement, the intent was clear enough. Ambassador Grethvaz of the Keth rose to his full height. The extraction operation was legally sanctioned under existing charter provisions for unclaimed developmental zone resources. The resources, Draxianen said, of a living, sentient civilization, are not, by any reasonable interpretation of our founding principles, unclaimed. The founding principles, Grethvaz replied, specify that resource claims in developmental zones require notification to all existing council members, which was done, and carry no obligation to non-member species. Perhaps, Draxian said, we are about to learn what happens when the non-member species decides to develop their own obligations. Another silence. What they have done, Ambassador Sankai spoke for the first time, in the precise harmonic that the translation matrix rendered as something between clinical analysis and impressed gravity, is build 12 ships. 12 ships of a technology class that none of the 412 members of this council currently possesses. In approximately 5 years. From a zero baseline. Without any outside assistance, information, or cooperation. While an active extraction operation was being conducted in their home system. The chamber absorbed this. What are the odds? High Chancellor Vara said, not a rhetorical question directed at the Sankai, who were the closest thing the council had to collective rapid analysis, that a species in that developmental position achieves dark matter weaponization in 5 years? The Sankai were quiet for a moment, which was unusual. We ran the probability model, they said, before this session. The answer is not a finite number. The scenario was not in our model. The scenario was not in any model any council species has ever constructed. Because it's impossible? Mora of the Philindri asked. No, said the Sankai. Because we never thought to model it. We never thought a species would try. High Chancellor Vara called a recess after 4 hours of debate, during which roughly nothing had been resolved and the political temperature of the chamber had risen significantly. She went to her private office, a room behind the main chamber, smaller and quieter with a view of Velther Prime's ancient ocean, and sat for a while. She had been chancellor for 40 years. She had dealt with border wars and resource disputes and 3 different attempted coups of member governments and a mass extinction event in the Outer Arm that required a decade of coordinated council response. She had dealt with species that were difficult and species that were dangerous and species that were both. She had never dealt with a species that was, if she was being precise, correct. That was the problem. That was what made this session different from every difficult session before it. Because underneath all the procedural arguments and the charter citations and the political maneuvering, the thing that sat at the center of everything, the thing that everyone in that chamber was being very careful not to say too directly, was this. Humanity was right. Not technically right. Not procedurally right. Morally right. The Keth extraction operation had been wrong. Not illegal under current council law, but wrong. The council's failure to protect a sentient civilization in its developmental zone had been wrong. And humanity's response, building the capability to defend themselves, demonstrating it in a way that was targeted and controlled and without civilian casualties, was not, by any reasonable moral measure, an aggression. It was a response. It was, if you stripped away every layer of political complexity and institutional self-interest, simply a civilization saying, enough. And the Chancellor had been doing this job long enough to know that when a civilization reached that point, when enough was enough, the only response that actually worked in the long run was to actually listen. She opened her channel to Commander Cole. Commander, she said. This is Chancellor Vara. I'd like to speak with you privately if you're willing. A brief pause. I'm willing, Chancellor, said Commander Cole's voice. Clear, steady, with no particular deference in it. Not aggressive, just the voice of someone who was done performing smallness. What would you like to talk about? I'd like, said the Chancellor, to understand what you actually want. Not the diplomatic phrasing. Not the formal request. What you, as the person sitting in that command chair right now, actually want. Another pause. Longer this time. Chancellor, Sarah Cole said, I want the Keth to go home. I want our solar system back. I want the Council to acknowledge that we exist, not as a developmental case study, not as an interesting observation, but as a civilization with standing and rights and the same right to exist without being strip-mined that every council member takes for granted. And I want... She stopped. Go on, the Chancellor said. I want my planet to be able to stop looking at the stars and being afraid, Sarah Cole said. That's what I want. All of it. That's what we built 12 ships for. The Chancellor was quiet for a long moment. Absymjishai, she said, and she said it in the language she'd seen in the human broadcast, because she'd had her team translate it, and it had struck her. From this moment forward, I think we can have a real conversation. The Keth Dominion fleet did not respond to Commander Cole's message for 18 hours. 18 hours was, for a species of the Keth's capabilities, Their communication systems operated at near instantaneous speeds across the solar system, not a technical delay. 18 hours was a choice. A deliberate, considered choice, which told Sarah Cole and Admiral Torres and everyone else monitoring the situation something important. The Keth were thinking. The Keth did not normally think about species like humanity. The Keth's operational doctrine for developing species was essentially a flowchart, and most of the flowchart was arrows pointing in one direction, because developing species almost never generated decision points. They objected and then they were managed. They protested and then they were managed. They occasionally built better weapons and those weapons were assessed, classified below the relevant management threshold, and then the species was managed. There was no box on the Keth flowchart that said dark matter Lance. Unknown classification. Recalculate. But here they were. The response, when it came, was delivered by Keth Fleet Commander Draxen, the senior military authority of the Keth extraction fleet, on an open channel that the Council was monitoring. This was, in itself, a communication. The Keth were aware that the Council was watching and had decided that what they said next should be seen. Fleet Commander Draxen's message translated. Commander Cole. Sol system vessel unbroken. The Keth Dominion acknowledges the existence and demonstrated capability of your dark matter weapon system. We assess that this system represents a significant and previously unidentified threat matrix and we are adjusting our operational parameters accordingly. However, the Keth Dominion's extraction rights in the Sol system are legally valid under Galactic Council Charter and will not be terminated on the basis of an act of what we classify as aggressive provocation. The destruction of Drone Station KD-7 is recorded as a hostile act. We are formally notifying the Galactic Council of this classification. We do not intend to escalate at this time. We will continue extraction operations on the current schedule. Any further interference with Keth extraction assets will be considered an act of war under Council jurisdiction. That is our response. Sarah Cole read the translated message twice. Well, said Lieutenant Holt from his station, they definitely looked at us. They definitely did, she said. They're still mining, said Ensign Brooks from navigation. Yes, they are. So what do we do? Sarah Cole was quiet for a moment. She pulled up the tactical display, the real-time positioning of the Keth fleet, all 18 primary ships, dozens of secondary vessels, hundreds of automated drones. She looked at them the way a chess player looks at a board, calmly, without hurry, finding the shape of things. The Keth's response told her several important things. First, they were afraid. They wouldn't admit it in any diplomatic language, but the 18-hour deliberation and the carefully worded message said afraid in a language that didn't need translation. A species that was not afraid does not say we are adjusting our operational parameters. A species that is not afraid does not say we do not intend to escalate at this time. At this time. That was the phrase. That was the tell. Second, they were watching the Council. Their decision to deliver the message on an open channel was strategic. They wanted the Council to see that the Keth were still asserting their legal position, still operating within Council framework, still playing by the rules. Because the Keth understood, with the wisdom of a 6,000-year-old civilization, that the Council's support was the anchor of their legal claim. If the Council withdrew support, the legal claim was gone. And third, and this was the most important thing, they were still mining. They were still mining because they needed to still be mining. Because backing down without something to show for it was a kind of loss that the Keth couldn't absorb, not politically, not in terms of their standing with other Council members. They needed to save face. They needed an exit that didn't look like running. Sarah Cole understood this because she had read every available document on Keth political culture that the intelligence team had assembled over 5 years. She had read it because she was the kind of commander who believed that the most important weapon in any conflict was understanding what the other side actually needed. Get me the Council channel, she said. I want to speak in the emergency session. Directly. They gave her 10 minutes. 10 minutes of speaking time in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council. A room she had never seen, speaking to beings whose civilizations predated human writing, via transmitted video. She sat at the communication station on the Unbroken Bridge in her uniform with her crew at their posts behind her, and she spoke to the most powerful governing body in the galaxy. High Chancellor. Members of the Council. I'll be brief because I think directness is appropriate right now, and I think you've all had enough indirect communication for one session. The Keth fleet has declined to withdraw. They've classified our demonstration as a hostile act and said they'll treat further interference as an act of war. I want to address that characterization directly and then I want to make a proposal. On the characterization, we destroyed an unmanned automated drone. Drone Station KD-7 had no biological occupants. It was selected specifically for that reason. We broadcast our intention to do so 60 seconds in advance, on every available channel. If the Keth Dominion wishes to classify the destruction of a remote extraction machine, operating in a solar system it entered without consent, as a hostile act, then I respectfully suggest that the Council consider the sequence of events that preceded it. The Keth entered our solar system without notification. They conducted extraction operations on our resources without notification. When we attempted contact, they told us, essentially, that we were inconvenient. They disabled our military assets when we responded defensively. And then they continued mining for 5 years while we were told, by the Council, that we needed to wait 40 to 60 years to even file a membership application. I am not here to relitigate every decision of the last 5 years. I am here to tell you that we built 12 ships because we had no other option, and we demonstrated our capability because the alternative was remaining invisible. And being invisible, for us, was not working. Now, the proposal. We do not want a war with the Keth Dominion. We do not want a war with anyone. What we want, what humanity has wanted from the beginning, is to be treated as a civilization. Not managed. Not observed from a distance. Not routed around where convenient. Treated as a civilization. The Keth need an exit that preserves their standing. I understand that. I am offering them one. The Council establishes a formal emergency membership review for the Sol system. The Keth agree to a phased withdrawal over 30 days, which they can frame as a voluntary compliance with new Council jurisdiction. In exchange, humanity agrees not to pursue any further unilateral action during the withdrawal period and commits to formal Council membership negotiations. Everybody gets something. Nobody has to lose face. And we can stop pointing weapons at each other long enough to actually talk. That's the proposal. I'm open to questions. She had not expected applause. She didn't get applause. What she got was something more valuable. 12 seconds of complete silence in a room that contained 412 alien beings who had, collectively, seen nearly everything. And then High Chancellor Vara said, in a voice that carried something the translation matrix struggled with. Something between respect and a particular kind of weariness that comes from having been wrong about something for a long time. The Council will deliberate on the proposal. Ambassador San Kai transmitted privately to the Chancellor, in the precise harmonic that translated to, she's right. She's been right the entire time. HFY, from this moment forward, we need to update our developmental assessment frameworks. Significantly. And Ambassador Draxianen, the oldest voice in the room, said to no one in particular, in a transmission that went to the general channel by accident or by design, 400,000 years of records, and this is the first time I can recall a pre-contact civilization addressing this chamber. I find I am not displeased about it. The Galactic Council deliberated for 11 hours. During those 11 hours, the Unbroken held its position near the asteroid belt, and the Keth fleet held its position near Jupiter, and the 10 other human ships of the 7th Dark Matter Division held their various positions throughout the solar system, and approximately 11 billion human beings on and around Earth waited in a state of collective, held-breath anticipation that no previous moment in human history had quite matched. News of the Unbroken's demonstration had been public since the moment it happened. Sarah Cole had made sure of that. Every transmission, every council exchange, every word of her address to the emergency session had been broadcast on Earth's networks simultaneously. The decision to be completely transparent had been deliberate and argued over extensively in planning, and Sarah Cole had won the argument with a single observation. If we're asking Earth's people to trust that we're doing this right, they need to see us doing it. All of it. So Earth watched. 11 billion people, in cities and towns and station habitats and colony ships, watched the feeds. Watched the council chamber debates, translated in real time. Watched the Keth fleet's positioning data, displayed on every major news network as a tactical map that most people had never expected to find themselves reading. Watched the status indicators for 12 warships that had been built in secret by people they had never known existed, crewed by people they were now learning the names of. Commander Sarah Cole became, in those 11 hours, the most recognized face on Earth. Not because anyone had decided to make her that, but because the feeds kept coming back to the Unbroken's bridge, to the clips of her transmission to the Council, to the image of a woman sitting in a command chair looking at the stars with an expression that was resolute in a way that felt, to 11 billion people who had spent 5 years being afraid, like something they had needed to see. Her mother called. Sarah didn't pick up because she was monitoring 11 different data channels simultaneously, but she saw the missed call and felt it somewhere under everything else. She'd call back when this was over. The Keth moved in the 9th hour of deliberation. Not the fleet. The individual ships held position. What moved was 7 additional extraction drones, newly deployed from drone storage bays on 2 Keth secondary vessels, launched toward the outer asteroid belt on a trajectory that took them as far from the Unbroken's position as the geometry of the belt allowed. A message accompanied the drone launch, sent on the Council's open channel, addressed to the Council rather than to Sarah Cole directly. The Keth Dominion, in accordance with its legally valid extraction rights, is continuing operations while Council deliberation proceeds. This is consistent with existing charter provisions that hold that operations under valid claims are not subject to suspension pending review. We are not escalating. We are operating. Sarah Cole read the message. She read the drone trajectory data. She looked at the tactical display for a long time. They're testing us, Ben Holt said quietly from tactical. Yes, she said. If we don't respond, they're establishing that they can continue operating regardless of the Council session. If we do respond, they've got their act of war classification. Yes, she said again. It's a good play. Commander. I know, Ben. She was quiet for a moment. The drones were moving. The Council was deliberating. The Keth fleet was watching. Earth was watching. The entire Galactic Council, 412 civilizations, was watching. Get me Admiral Torres, she said. Torres came on within 30 seconds. She'd been awake for the full 11 hours. Sarah could hear it in the compression of her voice, the particular flatness of a person running on discipline and caffeine. I see them, Torres said. What's the read? Political, Torres said. Not tactical. They're not deploying weapons, they're deploying tools. They're telling the Council, we're still here, we're still valid, we're not backing down. If we shoot the drones, we've fired twice in 24 hours and they get to frame us as the aggressors. And if we don't? Then they establish the precedent that they can operate through the Council session, and if the session goes badly for them, they'll have moved significantly more extraction assets into position before the outcome. So neither option is good. Neither option is clean, Torres said. But there is a third option. Tell me. We move, Torres said. Not to intercept. Not to threaten. We put the Unbroken between the drones and the asteroid belt. Not blocking, we don't have the numbers to block 17 active drones anyway. But present. Visible. Every sensor on those drones will register our position. Every Keth monitoring station will see us there. Sarah considered this. We're not stopping them, she said. No. We're making them stop themselves. Because every extraction drone that approaches an armed dark matter warship is a Keth operator making a calculation. Is this drone worth the risk? And the Keth are efficient. They don't take losses they don't have to take. If being present raises the cost-benefit calculation enough. They'll redirect the drones, Sarah finished. It's not guaranteed, Torres said carefully. Nothing is, Sarah said. Brooks, adjust our course. I want us between the drone deployment vectors and the outer belt. Not blocking, but present. Aye, Commander, Tyler Brooks said. Adjusting course. The Unbroken moved. The Keth drones redirected within 40 minutes. Not all of them. 4 continued on modified trajectories that technically avoided the Unbroken's position while still accessing the outer belt regions. But 7 of the 17 turned on Keth operator direction, and found new paths that took them away from the Unbroken's presence zone. It was not a victory. But it was a data point. A Keth cost-benefit calculation, visible and measurable. The Unbroken existed in the Keth's operational planning now as a variable. Not a certainty, not yet, but a variable. Something to be routed around where convenient. Where convenient. They had used that phrase 5 years ago. We will avoid direct biological contact zones where convenient. Like humanity was terrain. Like they were a hill or a weather system. And now the Keth were routing around a single human warship. The math was different. The math was finally actually different. In the Council chamber, Ambassador Draxianen watched the drone repositioning data with the careful attention of someone who had spent 200 years reading the movements of civilizations. Note the 7 drones, Draxianen said on the General Council channel. We see them, Mora of the Philindri said. The Keth just performed a cost-benefit reassessment of their operational parameters in real time, in response to the presence. Only the presence, not the action, of one human vessel. Your point? Grethvaz of the Keth said, with the specific flatness of a being who knew exactly what the point was and would prefer it not be said aloud. My point, Ambassador, Draxianen said, is that the cost-benefit calculation that the Keth Dominion performed when they filed this extraction claim 5 years ago, The calculation that determined that Sol System's inhabitants were not a relevant variable was incorrect. And if that calculation was incorrect, the legal claim built on it may warrant re-examination. High Chancellor Vara watched this exchange and made a decision. The Council will vote, she said, on the emergency membership review proposal for the Sol System. And simultaneously, the Council will review the original Keth extraction claim documentation for procedural accuracy. Grethvaz of the Keth rose to his full height. The Keth Dominion objects. The Keth Dominion's objection is noted, said the Chancellor, in the voice she used when she had decided something and the discussion was over. We will vote. The vote took 3 hours to prepare and 11 minutes to conduct. There were 2 resolutions on the table. Resolution 1. Emergency Provisional Membership Review for the Sol System. If passed, this would formally recognize humanity as an emerging member civilization under Council jurisdiction, granting them legal standing and triggering a mandatory review of any active claims on their system's resources. It required a 2/3 majority, 275 votes from 412. Resolution 2. Procedural Review of Keth Dominion Resource Claim KD Sol, 7734. If passed, this would trigger a formal audit of the extraction claims documentation for compliance with all relevant charter provisions, including the contested question of whether an inhabited developmental zone could be classified as unclaimed. It required only a simple majority, 207 votes. The vote was public. Every member civilization's representative had to declare openly. There was no secret ballot for emergency resolutions. Transparency was in theory one of the Council's foundational principles, though in practice it had been applied more selectively than the founding documents implied. High Chancellor Vara called the vote. For Resolution 2, the procedural review, the vote was not close. 314 votes for, 67 against, 31 abstentions. Even some of the Keth's traditional allies voted for the procedural review, because a procedural review was defensible. A procedural review was process. It was the Council doing its job. Voting against it would have meant saying openly that the Council should not check its own work, and there were limits to how far even political allies would go in public. Ambassador Grethvaz of the Keth registered his objection formally. It was noted. For Resolution 1, Emergency Provisional Membership, the math was closer and the deliberation was longer, and there were 3 speeches that the historical record would preserve, because 3 beings in that chamber said things that were worth keeping. The first was Ambassador Sankai, who said, "We have observed Sol 3 for 300 years. In 300 years of observation, we have watched them face every catastrophe their planet could produce and build something from the wreckage every time. We watched them split the atom and then spend decades genuinely terrified of what they had done, and spend those decades building international frameworks to prevent themselves from using it. We watched them damage their own climate system and then mount a planetary-scale coordinated response over 4 generations. We have watched a species that is, by our measures, by any of our measures, young and volatile and emotionally intense, spend its entire history arguing with itself about how to be better and then actually becoming better measurably across centuries. Whatever we expected from them, they have consistently become more than that. The vote for provisional membership is not charity. It is recognition of a reality that already exists." The second was Ambassador Grethvaz of the Keth Dominion, who said, "The Keth Dominion maintains that this entire proceeding is procedurally improper and that the vote, if it proceeds, will set a precedent that destabilizes the Council's developmental zone framework for every member civilization with active claims. We do not dispute that the Sol species has demonstrated unexpected capabilities. We dispute that unexpected capabilities are, by themselves, sufficient to override established legal frameworks. Caro, let the record show our objection." And then he sat down because there was nothing else to say and he knew it. The third was Ambassador Draxianen of the Draxi Collective, who rose from their seat and said, in the voice of the oldest active member in the chamber, "I have been in this body for 212 years. I have watched the Council make decisions that I believed were right, and I have watched it make decisions that I knew were wrong but said nothing because the political cost of speaking was too high. I'm not going to do that today. What happened in the Sol system was wrong. Not procedurally it was defensible. But wrong. I think we have known it was wrong for 5 years and preferred to define wrong in procedural terms because that is more comfortable. HFY, from this moment forward, I would like us to be a council that does not prefer comfort to correctness. Vote yes." The vote for Resolution 1, 291 for, 88 against, 33 abstentions, 291 votes, 16 more than required. The Sol system was in. Sarah Cole got the result on a data feed relay, watching the vote tallies in real time on the tactical display. When the final count came through, she sat very still for a long moment. Her crew had been watching too. There was silence on the unbroken bridge for 5 full seconds. Then James Okafor said very quietly, "Commander, we're in." And the bridge erupted. Not military composure erupted. Erupted. People who had been holding professional stillness for 27 hours of sustained crisis suddenly let go of it all at once. There was noise that was laughing and noise that was crying and noise that was some combination of the two that didn't have a clean name. Tyler Brooks, youngest officer on the ship, 24 years old and trying very hard to maintain his dignity, put his face in his hands. Rosa Martinez, down in engineering, transmitted up to the bridge. "Commander, what just happened? I'm getting some very non-standard emotional readings from the crew." "We're in, Rosa," Sarah said. Her voice was not quite steady. She was aware of this and decided not to correct it. A pause from engineering. Then, "Oh. Commander, I need a minute." "Take your minute, Rosa." "Caro," Rosa said, and then there was the sound of someone in engineering who was definitely not crying, definitely not sitting down heavily in a chair. Sarah Cole looked at the stars. At the asteroid belt. At the spot where KD-7 used to be, which had become, she was aware, a kind of symbol. Not of destruction. Of something else. Of the moment when the calculation changed. She was 38 years old. She had spent 16 years working towards something she had not been entirely certain was possible. And it was not over. The Keth were still here, the withdrawal hadn't happened, the membership review hadn't happened, 100 things still needed to happen. But something had changed that was real and irreversible, and she felt it in her chest, and she let herself feel it for exactly 45 seconds. Then she put it away. "Open a channel to Admiral Torres," she said. "And then I need all department heads for a tactical review. We still have 17 Keth ships in this system, and the vote doesn't move them." "Aye, Commander," Okafor said, his voice still thick. "And Okafor? Commander? Good work. All of you. Every hour of the last 27. A beat." "Thank you, Commander," he said. She nodded once and looked back at the stars. From this moment forward, the Keth fleet did not begin withdrawing. This was, in the immediate hours after the Council vote, the most urgent reality on the table. The vote had changed humanity's legal status. It had triggered the procedural review of the extraction claim. But it had not, could not, under the Council's own rules, retroactively cancel an active extraction operation in progress. The Keth Dominion still had valid claim documentation on file. The procedural review would take time. And in the time it took, the Keth fleet was still in the solar system, still operational. Ambassador Greth Voss transmitted to the Unbroken directly. It was the first direct communication between the Keth Dominion and a human being in the entire history of contact, and it was, in its way, a significant moment, because the Keth had spent 5 years refusing to acknowledge humanity as worth communicating with. "Commander Cole," the translated message said, "the Keth Dominion acknowledges the Council vote. We will comply with the procedural review. We will not, however, suspend operations until the review is complete and a formal determination is made regarding our claim status. This is our right under Council Charter. We are telling you this directly as the Council's provisional member representatives as a courtesy." As a courtesy. They were using the word courtesy with her. That was new. Sarah Cole composed her response carefully. "Ambassador Greth Voss, we acknowledge your message and your position on continued operations. We want to be clear. We are not going to allow the procedural review period to become a window for accelerated extraction. Our ships will maintain their current positions throughout the review. Any significant change in Keth operational tempo, drone deployment numbers, extraction output, fleet positioning, will be interpreted as an attempt to extract maximum value before the review concludes, and we will respond accordingly. We are telling you this directly as new Council members as a courtesy." She sent it. Ben Holt looked at her. That last line. "I know," she said. "That's going to." "I know, Ben." Pause. "It's good," he said and went back to his station. The next 4 days were the most complex of the operation, in the way that negotiations are always more complex than battles, because battles have clear outcomes and negotiations have only varying degrees of ambiguity. The Keth fleet did not change its extraction tempo. That was the key data point. Sarah's response, combined with the Council vote and the procedural review announcement, had created a situation where the cost-benefit calculation of accelerated extraction was no longer in the Keth's favor. Every additional drone deployed was another data point for the procedural review. Every additional extraction output was something that could be used to argue before the council that the Keth had been operating in bad faith. The Keth were 6,000 years old. They knew how to read political weather. Meanwhile, the council's procedural review team, led by, at Draxianen's insistence, a mixed panel of 6-member civilizations, none of whom had existing claims in developmental zones, none of whom had economic ties to the Keth Dominion, began working through the claim documentation. They found 3 procedural irregularities within the first 48 hours. The first was technical. The notification requirement for resource claims in inhabited developmental zones specified that notification must be provided to the Council's Developmental Observation Committee, which it had been, but the original charter provision also included a subclause, inserted 3,000 years ago, in an amendment that had never been tested, specifying that notification must also be provided to any Council-recognized observation record for the relevant zone. Earth had a Council observation record. It had had one for 200 years. The notification had not been provided to the record custodians. A technicality. A small one. But real. The second was more significant. The Keth Dominion's original claim filing had classified the Sol system as a Grade 3 resource zone, defined as a system with no sentient life capable of meaningful self-determination. The classification had been made based on an assessment conducted by a Keth survey vessel 80 years prior. The assessment had noted the presence of primitive biological entities but had classified them as not meeting the sentience threshold, because the threshold in use at the time was a different, more restrictive standard than the one currently in force. The current standard, revised in a Council Charter update 40 years ago, would classify humanity as sentient. Clearly, unambiguously sentient by every metric in the revised standard. The Keth claim had been filed under the old standard. The claim had been approved under the old standard. But the operation had been active for 5 years, well past the charter amendment date. There was a legitimate legal question about whether a claim approved under a superseded standard could be maintained when the standard that would have applied to a new filing would have produced a different result. The third was the most damaging. The Keth Dominion had filed a supplementary assessment of Sol system resources 18 months before deploying the extraction fleet. That assessment, internal documentation, not part of the public filing, contained a note from the assessment officer that had not been included in the final filing. The note read, translated, Biological Presence Assessment. Multiple sapient class entities distributed across multiple system bodies. Recommend additional evaluation before classification. The Keth Dominion had received an internal recommendation to do additional evaluation. They had filed the claim anyway. They had never done the additional evaluation. The procedural review team published its preliminary findings on day 4. The Galactic Council chamber did not erupt, because it was the Galactic Council and they had a great deal of practice at institutional restraint. But Ambassador Grethvaz of the Keth was very quiet for a long time after the findings were released. And then he asked for a private channel with Commander Cole. Commander, Grethvaz said in the translation matrix's rendering, which gave his voice a kind of weight that Sarah was beginning to think might be accurate. I am speaking without the authorization of Keth Dominion leadership. I am speaking as, I will call myself a realist, because that is accurate and does not require me to say other things that would be politically difficult. I understand, Sarah said carefully. The procedural findings, he said. You've read them. Yes. The third finding, he said. The internal assessment note. I want you to know, and I want the Council to know, that I was not aware of that note when I managed this operation from the Council side. The filing documentation I was given did not include it. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this. You're saying you didn't know they had an internal recommendation against the classification. I'm saying, Grethvaz said, that someone in Keth Dominion administrative channels made a decision about what to include in the filing. And that decision was made without my knowledge. And that if I had known I would have, the filing would have been different. This was, Sarah understood, an extraordinary thing for the Keth ambassador to say. It was not an apology. The Keth did not apologize, not structurally, not as a cultural practice, but it was something. It was a distinction. It was a Keth official drawing a line between himself and the decision that had produced this outcome. Ambassador, she said, why are you telling me this? Because, Grethvaz said, the Keth Dominion leadership is going to resist the withdrawal. They are going to fight the procedural findings. They are going to use every available Council mechanism to delay a final determination, and they are going to try to use that delay to extract maximum value. I do not have the authority to prevent that. I can tell you that it is going to happen. And you're telling me because? Because, he said, and the translation matrix gave this a quality that might have been something like reluctant honesty, you will need to respond to it. And I would prefer your response to be measured. The Keth Dominion is 6,000 years old. The decisions being made right now are being made by people who are afraid in a way my species is not practiced at being afraid. Fear makes bad decisions. I do not want to be in this chamber when the history of this contact is written in a way that reflects badly on my civilization's judgment. Sarah Cole looked at the stars for a moment. Ambassador, she said, I appreciate this. Genuinely. For what it's worth, I'm not interested in humiliating the Keth Dominion. I'm interested in getting them out of our solar system and getting our people back to being able to look at Jupiter without grieving what used to be there. If you can help us find an exit that your leadership can accept without losing everything, I will take it. Caro, he said, the word was the same across the translation matrix, carrying the same weight in Keth that it carried in the human languages it had been borrowed from, a sound of acknowledgement and weight. Then let us think together about what that exit looks like. The exit that Ambassador Grethvaz and Commander Cole worked out, over 14 hours of increasingly detailed conversation, was not elegant. Elegant solutions rarely survive contact with political reality. What they built was functional, survivable and real. The core structure was this. The Keth Dominion would not formally withdraw their extraction claim. Instead, they would place it in a voluntary administrative suspension, a council-recognized status that acknowledged ongoing legal proceedings without admitting wrongdoing. The suspension would pause all active extraction operations. The fleet would maintain positions for a 30-day cooling period, during which the procedural review would complete, and then, under the terms of the suspension agreement, would begin a phased withdrawal from the solar system, with full departure completed within 90 days. In exchange, humanity would not pursue damages for the 5 years of extraction that had already occurred. This was, politically, the most difficult part for Earth. 5 years of Jupiter's hydrogen, Saturn's rings, the outer asteroid belt's exotic elements. The loss was real and measurable. Not pursuing damages meant absorbing that loss. Sarah Cole took this to Admiral Torres, who took it to the coordinated government coalition that had built the fleet, who argued about it for 6 hours before reaching a conclusion that Admiral Torres transmitted back to Sarah with characteristic compression. We accept. The resources are gone. The precedent of them being gone matters less than the precedent of us having standing. Take the deal. The deal also included 2 provisions that Sarah had insisted on and that Grethvaz had negotiated into the Keth Dominion's framework. First, the Keth Dominion would participate in the drafting of a revised developmental zone protocol, which would update the Council's framework for observing and interacting with emerging civilizations. The revision would close the loophole that had allowed the Sol system extraction and would establish new protections for any civilization above the revised sentience threshold. Second, the Keth Dominion would provide to the Council's archives complete documentation of every extraction claim currently held in developmental zones, every star system, every resource category, every supporting assessment. All of it available for procedural review by the new member-inclusive panel. This second provision was, of all of them, the one that made the Keth Dominion's leadership most uncomfortable, because it was not just about Sol. It was about every system they had ever claimed. It was the accounting. Grethvaz had pushed back on it hard. Sarah had held on it hard. The accounting matters, she had said. Not because we want to punish you. Because every civilization on that list deserves to know they're on it. If there are systems out there with emerging civilizations that have been strip-mined the way ours was, they deserve to know. They deserve what we have now, a chance to speak. That's not negotiable, Ambassador. Caro, that's the line. A long silence. You understand, Grethvaz had said, that this will expose the Keth Dominion to significant council sanction. Yes, she said. And you're asking me to accept that. I'm asking you, she said, to be the Keth official who helped prevent a war and corrected a framework that was hurting civilizations who had no voice. I'm asking you to be the version of this story that your civilization's history treats well. Another silence. HFY, Grethvaz said finally. From this moment forward, the Keth Dominion accepts the provision. The agreement was signed, or whatever its alien diplomatic equivalent was, at a formal council session on day 6 of the crisis. High Chancellor Vara presided. All 412 member civilizations witnessed. The session included one moment that was not protocol, not procedure, not precedent. It was High Chancellor Vara, at the end of the formal proceedings, deviating from the script she had prepared to say, on the open record of the Council's permanent archive. The Council formally acknowledges that the Sol System's inhabitants were treated, under our existing framework, in a manner inconsistent with the principles our founding documents claim to uphold. The legal mechanisms that allowed this were real. The legal mechanisms do not exhaust the question of what we owed them. We owed them recognition. We owed them communication. We owed them the right to be part of the decisions being made about their home. We failed to provide these things, and the consequences of that failure fell entirely on them. The Council formally acknowledges this. Carol. It is in the record now. We will build from it. It was the most honest thing the Galactic Council had said in a very long time. It was in the record. Marcus Webb, 60 years old, watching the Council session on a feed in his office at MIT, took off his glasses and set them on the desk and sat quietly for a while. Priya Anand, 45, watching from her office across the hall, knocked on his open door. Marcus. I know. It's done. I know. Pause. We were right, she said. In the way we hoped we were. Not just the physics, the whole thing. He looked at her. We were right, he said. A lot of other people were right too. A lot of people built a lot of things. But it started here, she said. These 4 walls. 3 in the morning. When I found the collapse dynamic. He nodded slowly. Outside his window, Cambridge was going about its day, cars and bicycles and people walking, normal and ordinary, in a solar system that was, as of this morning, no longer being mined without consent. Priya, he said. Yes. Go get lunch. You always forget lunch. She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that has a lot of things in it. You too, she said. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I think I will. The Keth fleet began its phased withdrawal on day 31, exactly on the agreed schedule. Sarah Cole watched it happen from the bridge of the Unbroken. She had been in the solar system, aboard the ship, in orbit holding position, for 41 days at this point. She had slept less than she should have, eaten approximately what she needed to function, and had exactly one conversation with her mother, who had cried on the phone and said things that Sarah found difficult to receive gracefully but tried. She watched the Keth fleet move. First the secondary vessels, the drone tenders, the maintenance ships, the smaller craft that had supported the extraction operation, turning on new vectors and beginning the long acceleration out of the solar system. Then, after 2 weeks, the primary extraction vessels, enormous and slow, the ships that had been parked at Jupiter and Saturn for 5 years, pulling away from the planets they had been feeding on and orienting outward. The last Keth ship to leave the Sol system was a medium-sized fleet support vessel, and it departed on day 87, 3 days ahead of the 90-day deadline. Grethvaz had made sure of the early departure. It was, in the way that only diplomats fully appreciate, a gesture. When the last Keth ship crossed the heliopause and was definitively gone from the Sol system, Sarah Cole let her crew have 15 minutes. Not an order. She just said, "We have 15 minutes." And everyone understood. The sounds that filled those 15 minutes were varied and human, and she did not try to document them. She heard laughter, and she heard some things that were not laughter. She heard Rosa Martinez, down in engineering, say "Oh, Kara" one more time very softly, and she heard Tyler Brooks transmit something to his family that he must have forgotten was on an open channel before he caught himself and cut the transmission. She stood at the viewport and looked at the place where the Keth fleet had been. At Jupiter, enormous and banded and ancient, still there. Still itself, still mostly what it had been, though with measurable reductions in certain atmospheric layers that the scientists were already cataloging and would study for decades. Still there. After 15 minutes, she turned back to her crew. "All right," she said. "We have work to do. The membership negotiations start in 2 weeks. The developmental zone protocol revision starts next month. And we have 11 other ships in this fleet whose crews deserve to know what comes next." "What does come next, Commander?" Tyler Brooks asked, genuinely, not rhetorically, the question of someone 24 years old standing at the beginning of something. Sarah Cole thought about this. "Everything," she said. "Everything comes next. We just became members of a 400,000-year-old governing body. We have 12 ships with technology none of them have. We have about a century of diplomatic relationships to build from scratch and 1,000 things to learn and an unknown number of things to teach. And we have a planet full of people who have been afraid for 6 years and need to not be afraid anymore." "That's a lot," Brooks said. "Yes," she agreed. "So let's not waste the 15 minutes we've already had." The membership negotiations were exactly as complex as everyone had expected and more interesting than anyone had quite predicted, because it turned out that humanity, for all its youth, for all its volatility and emotional intensity and tendency to express disagreement loudly and at length, was very good at negotiation when it mattered. This was possibly because humanity had been negotiating with itself for its entire history, in every combination of parties imaginable, in every language and cultural context and power differential, and had developed, through the sheer volume of practice, a kind of intuitive negotiating intelligence that older civilizations, who had achieved internal stability long before they needed to deal with external parties, had never quite needed. The lead human negotiators were a team of 5, selected by the coalition government from a global pool of diplomatic candidates. The team was led by Ambassador First Class Dr. Elena Vasquez, 62, from Madrid, who had spent 30 years in international Earth diplomacy and brought to the Council negotiations the specific quality of someone who has sat across from difficult parties in difficult circumstances and never, once, lost the thread of what she was actually there to accomplish. Vasquez had a style that was difficult to categorize. She was warm and she was precise and she was genuinely interested in the beings across the table from her, in a way that was not performance but actual curiosity, the way a person is curious who grew up wanting to understand how other minds work and never stopped wanting that. The Sankai who experienced the world primarily through harmonic resonance and were not accustomed to emotional register being a relevant variable in diplomacy, found themselves, after their first 3-hour session with Vasquez, adjusting their own harmonic output in ways that their own analysts later described as responsive, unusual, effective. The Draxianan met with Vasquez privately after the second week and said in the Council translation matrix, "I have been in this chamber for 200 years. I want to tell you something that is not usually said directly. Your civilization's negotiators are not what we expected. We expected, given the military capability demonstration, someone more aggressive, more transactional." Vasquez had smiled. "We can be aggressive when we need to be," she said. "We just don't think we need to be right now." "No," Draxianan said. "You need allies. You're making them." "We're trying to," she said. "Is it working?" "UBSYMGHY," Draxianan said. From this moment forward, the Draxi Collective would like to discuss a bilateral relationship framework with the Sol system. Earth changed in the months that followed. Not immediately, not dramatically, not the way science fiction had always imagined first contact changing humanity, no sudden unified planetary consciousness, no overnight transformation. It was slower and messier and more like everything else in human history, incremental, contested, complicated, and real. But it changed. The news of the Council vote, of the Keth withdrawal agreement, of humanity's formal provisional membership in a galactic governing body, it did something to the global psychological atmosphere that was difficult to quantify but not difficult to recognize. People who had spent 6 years looking at Jupiter in the sky and feeling a cold fear at what was being taken from them found themselves looking at it differently. Not because everything was fixed. Nothing was fixed, not really, not yet. But because the situation had changed in a way that mattered. They were not alone in the galaxy anymore. They had known they weren't, technically, since the Keth arrived. But there was a difference between not being alone in the way a mouse is not alone in a house full of people who don't notice it, and not being alone in the way a person is not alone in a room full of people who have looked them in the eye and said, "You are here. We see you. You have standing." That difference was everything. The children born in those months, there were more of them than in any year since the Keth arrived because people who are afraid have fewer children, and people who are less afraid have more. The children born in those months would grow up knowing the Galactic Council as a fact of their world, not a revelation. They would grow up in a solar system that was, in most of its extent, still theirs, still intact, still ancient and beautiful and worth protecting. They would grow up with the dark matter fleet as a given. They would grow up with Ambassador Vasquez on the Council feeds and Commander Cole's face in the textbooks, and with Marcus Webb's equations taught in every advanced physics curriculum on every planet and station and ship in the solar system, and with Priya Anand's name on the discovery credit for the directed dark matter collapse emitter right next to his. They would grow up knowing that their parents' generation had done something extraordinary in a dark moment, and they would inherit the ordinary life that extraordinary moment made possible. Sarah Cole came home to Earth for the first time in 14 months on a Thursday morning in April. She landed at Cape Canaveral, because the Unbroken was docking for its first full maintenance rotation and she had 42 days of mandatory leave that Admiral Torres had told her she would take or be confined to quarters. She walked out of the arrival terminal into Florida heat and Florida light and stood on the pavement for a moment. Her mother was there. Margaret Cole, 68 years old, her brown hair mostly gray now, wearing a yellow cardigan that she had owned for as long as Sarah could remember, standing on the other side of a rope barrier with an expression that was doing its best not to be what it was. Sarah walked over. "Mom," she said. "Sarah," her mother said and opened her arms. Sarah stepped in and let her mother hold her, and stood there being held, and was aware of how long it had been since she had been held, and was aware of the particular quality of being 40 years old and having your mother hold you, which is different from any other age and any other person. "Are you all right?" her mother asked. "Yes," Sarah said. "Yeah, I'm good." "You look tired." "I am tired." "Come home," her mother said. "I made dinner." "What did you make?" "Pot roast," her mother said. "You always like pot roast." "Yeah," Sarah said, and the word was carrying a lot of things and she knew it. "Yeah, I do." They walked to the car. Florida was Florida, hot, bright, slightly impractical, smelling of ocean and concrete, absolutely certain of its own rightness as a place to exist. Sarah put her bag in the trunk and got in the passenger seat and let her mother drive, the way she had let her mother drive when she was a child and the world was enormous and she was small in it and everything was still possible. She looked out the window at the sky. Clear blue. A few clouds. The sun mid-morning and sharp. Somewhere up there, too far to see, was Jupiter. And beyond Jupiter, the space where the Keth fleet had been and was no longer. And beyond that, the heliopause, where the last Keth ship had crossed the boundary of the solar system 3 months ago and kept going. And beyond that was the galaxy. 412 civilizations and whatever came next and all the distance and strangeness and possibility of a universe that was, it turned out, full of other minds looking at the same stars from different angles. HFY, she thought. From this moment forward. "Sarah," her mother said. "Yeah." "Were you scared? Out there?" She thought about it. Not performing consideration, actually thinking. "Yes," she said. "Some of the time." "But you did it anyway." "Yeah," she said. "That's what scared means. It doesn't mean you stop." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm very proud of you." Sarah looked at her. Her mother's eyes were on the road, but her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was trying not to cry. "I know," Sarah said. "I know, Mom." She reached over and took her mother's hand, the hand that was on the center console, and held it. Margaret Cole squeezed her daughter's hand and kept driving. They were quiet for a while and the quiet was good. Part 12. The Stars Remember Everything. 6 months after the Keth withdrawal, the first formal meeting of the expanded Galactic Council, with humanity's representatives seated as full provisional members, was held on Velther Prime. 11 humans attended in person. It was the largest human presence ever assembled outside the Sol system. They traveled on the Unbroken, which had been repaired, refitted, and upgraded during its maintenance rotation, and which carried, in addition to its crew of 437, a diplomatic contingent, a media team, a scientific delegation, and one stowaway who turned out to be Park Jin-ho, the young engineer who had said "oh" when KD-7 was destroyed, and who had technically transferred his assignment to the ship's maintenance crew 3 weeks before departure, which was Admiral Torres acknowledged, technically within regulations if barely. The journey to Velther Prime took 11 days on dark matter drive. 11 days of travel that would have taken conventional drives hundreds of thousands of years. 11 days of watching the stars change their angles and the familiar constellations drift and dissolve into new configurations as the Unbroken crossed the distances that human science fiction had always written about but human civilization had never actually traversed. Tyler Brooks navigated. He had been navigating dark matter transits for over a year at this point, but each one still produced in him a quality of attention that his colleagues recognized as genuine wonder rather than professional routine. He watched the stars and made notes in a personal log that he had been keeping since the beginning of the operation, which was, he was aware, the kind of thing that future historians might find interesting if the log survived, and which he was writing anyway because it helped him think. His entry for the second day of the transit to Velther Prime read, "I keep thinking about what it means to be the first. Not the first in history, there's no such thing as the first in history, someone is always before you. But the first to do this specific thing, to go to this specific place in this specific way. We're 11 days from a planet that no human being has ever been to, traveling faster than anything our grandparents believed was physically possible. There's no word for what that feels like. Not one word. It feels like being 24 years old and standing at the edge of everything you've ever read about and realized for the first time, that the edge is just a door. Carol. From here." Sarah Cole read the log entry because Tyler had shared it with the crew. He shared most of his log entries with the crew, which was something she appreciated about him. She read it twice and didn't say anything to him about it because some things are better received in silence. Velther Prime was a world that had been inhabited for 600,000 years and showed it in the way that very old inhabited worlds do. Not with ruins or decay but with a kind of settled depth, a landscape that has been lived in for so long that it has begun to reflect the minds that lived in it. The cities were grown rather than built. The Velthari architectural tradition produced structures that evolved over centuries, slow as coral reefs, each generation adding layers to what the previous generation had left. They glowed at night with their bioluminescent crystal walls, and from orbit they looked like a planet covered in lit windows, warm and inhabited beyond anything Earth had yet managed. The human delegation landed on a clear morning, local time, at a facility that had been prepared for their arrival, the first such preparation the Velthari had ever made for a species attending their first formal council session. High Chancellor Vara met them at the landing point. She was there in person, not represented, not delegated. Present. She was, in person, taller than her transmissions had suggested, and her Velthari biology produced visual effects that the diplomatic team had been briefed on but still found startling. A very faint bioluminescence in her skin, pulsing slowly with her breathing, the Velthari equivalent of expression visible in patterns that the translation AI had been updated to interpret. Her current pattern, the AI reported to Sarah's earpiece, indicated formal welcome, genuine curiosity, something that maps to guarded hope. Sarah Cole was the first off the Unbroken. She had been given this position deliberately, first off the ship because she had been the first to address the council, and consistency mattered, and symbolism was not nothing. She walked down the ramp and onto Velthar Prime's surface. Actual alien soil, actual alien sky, air that tasted different, gravity that was 0.94 of Earth's, light from a star that was not her star, and she stopped at the bottom of the ramp and looked at the High Chancellor of the Galactic Council. Commander Cole, Vara said. In the human languages her translation matrix had been studying for months, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. High Chancellor, Sarah said. Thank you for the welcome. Thank you for coming, Vara said. And for coming in peace. We've always wanted to come in peace, Sarah said. We just needed to be able to make the choice. A brief silence between them. Then the Chancellor said very quietly so that only Sarah could hear it through the translation. I owe your civilization an apology that the Council has not yet formally offered. I'm offering it now personally. What happened was wrong. What we permitted was wrong. I am sorry. Sarah looked at her for a moment. The Velthari Chancellor, 230 years old, one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, standing on her own world in the morning light of her own star, saying the words that needed to be said. Chancellor, Sarah said, I accept that. On behalf of no one, I don't have that authority. But as a human being, from me to you, I accept it. And I think we can do better. HFY, Vara said. From this moment forward. The phrase had spread in the weeks since Sarah had said it on the council broadcast. It had been picked up by translation teams, used in secondary dispatches, appeared in council documentation. It had become, in the strange way that phrases sometimes do, a marker of a moment. A before and after line. HFY, Sarah agreed. The first formal session of the expanded council, with humanity in attendance, lasted 8 hours and covered a range of business that was, by the standards of a body that had been operating for 400,000 years, fairly routine. Boundary clarifications. Resource allocation reviews. Membership committee updates. The ordinary administrative life of a galactic government proceeding through its agenda. Ambassador Vasquez sat at the human delegations table which had been placed, per the new provisional member protocols she had negotiated, on the second ring of the chamber, 1 tier up from the newest member positions, 2 tiers below the senior seats, exactly where she had argued it should be. Not at the edges. Not in the back. In the middle. In the working position. She had brought a notepad. An actual paper notepad because she thought better when writing by hand, and because she was 62 years old and had earned the right to her methods. The Sankai ambassador, whose species had no paper equivalent tradition and was fascinated by human material recording, watched her write during the session with the specific quality of curiosity that the translation AI characterized as genuinely charmed. During a recess, the Sankai ambassador approached the human delegations table. You write, the ambassador said in their precise harmonic translated through the matrix. I think better when I write, Vasquez said. On material substrate, the ambassador said. Organic and therefore impermanent. Everything I write eventually becomes impermanent, Vasquez said. But it's permanent long enough to be useful. That's what matters. The Sankai was quiet in a way that, per the AI, indicated processing something. Then, I would like to exchange information about human and Sankai information storage traditions. Would you be interested in this exchange? I'd love that, Vasquez said, and she meant it. Marcus Webb attended the session as part of the scientific delegation. He was 61 years old, and his back hurt from the gravity adjustment even at 0.94 g, and he had forgotten his lunch again, which Priya Anand had anticipated and brought for him despite having plenty of her own responsibilities as the session's scientific liaison. He sat in the second-ring gallery above the main chamber floor and watched the session proceed. He watched humans and aliens conduct the business of governance in a room that was the physical center of something 400,000 years old. He watched Ambassador Vasquez make notes on her notepad. He watched Tyler Brooks, who had no official reason to be in the gallery but had found his way there anyway, standing against the wall with an expression of unconcealed wonder that had not diminished 1 degree in the 9 months since he first appeared on the crew roster. Marcus thought about a laboratory under the Swiss Alps. About a transcription error. About Priya's voice at 6 in the morning saying I think I found a gun. About a young engineer saying oh in the silence after an asteroid was vaporized. About all the years of work that had been neither dramatic nor celebrated, just persistent, just necessary, just one equation and one calculation and one prototype and one test at a time. About how things begin. How they always begin in the ordinary, in the small room in the late night and the problem that won't leave you alone. He thought about the Keth, still out there, in their own space, with their 6,000-year history and their accounting obligations and their complicated reckoning with what had happened. He thought about the 37 other star systems in the Keth's full documentation disclosure that were currently being reviewed by the Council's expanded panel. 37 systems, some with emerging civilizations, some with civilizations that might have been emerging when the claim was filed and were at various stages of development now. 37 situations that needed to be looked at, addressed, corrected where possible. The work was not done. The work was never done. That was the nature of work. But it was started. It was genuinely, irreversibly started. He ate his sandwich. It was a good sandwich. Priya had remembered he liked mustard. The Unbroken returned to Earth 23 days after departing Velthor Prime. It came home on a Tuesday, which Sarah Cole noted was the same day of the week that the Keth fleet had first appeared 5 years ago. She didn't particularly believe in symmetry as a cosmic principle. But she noted it. They came into Earth orbit with their running lights on, a human naval tradition, lights on in port, and the planet below them was everything it had always been. Blue and white and brown, lit at the edges by the sun, turning slowly on its axis as it had been turning for 4.5 billion years, ancient and alive and improbable and home. Sarah Cole stood at the viewport of her ship and looked at it. She had been in the Unbroken's command chair, in one capacity or another, for 14 months. She had slept in a bunk 3 decks below the bridge and eaten in the officers' mess and worked through the kind of sustained, compounding fatigue that comes from being responsible for everything without the luxury of putting it down. She had made decisions she would spend years evaluating. She had said things she hoped she had said right. She had held together a crew through 41 days of crisis and 11 days of galactic transit and 6 months of operational readiness that was tiring in its entirety. And she had watched the Keth leave. And she had stood on Velthor Prime and spoken to the Chancellor and watched Vasquez write in her notebook and watched Tyler Brooks stand in the gallery with his young face full of everything that comes after the fear. And now she was home. "Commander," Tyler Brooks said from navigation, "Earth is requesting our arrival pattern preferences." "Standard approach," she said. "And let's make it visible. I want every sensor on the planet to pick us up on the way in. No dark drive. Full running lights. Let them see us coming home." "Aye, Commander," he said. Full running lights, standard approach. The Unbroken descended toward Earth, lit up and visible, and the people on the surface watched it come. There is a moment, historians would later argue about when exactly it was. Some said the vote, some said the Keth withdrawal, some said the Velthor Prime session. There is a moment after which humanity was not the species it had been before. Not a better species exactly. Not a worse one. Different in the specific way that things are different when the world they live in changes around them, and they change in response, not all at once but collectively, over time, in the way that species change, gradually and then suddenly, too slow to notice and then too obvious to miss. They were, still, a species that argued with itself constantly and loudly, that made mistakes and corrected some of them and failed to correct others, that was capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness in proportions that did not always favor the kindness. They were still afraid of things and uncertain about things and wrong about things in ways that were sometimes funny and sometimes not. But they were also something else now. They were a species that had looked at a wall and decided not to accept the wall. That had spent 5 years of sustained, collective, coordinated effort building something that the wall's builders had never predicted and could not fully account for. That had walked into the most powerful governing body in the galaxy and said we are here and made it true. That was not everything. But it was not nothing. Marcus Webb retired from active research 2 years after the Velther Prime session. He was 63 years old and his back hurt, and he had, by any reasonable measure, done enough. He went to live in a house on the coast of Maine near the ocean, where the light was good and the air tasted like cold salt. Priya Anand was appointed the first director of the Human Galactic Science Exchange Program, a joint initiative between Earth's research institutions and the Sankei Academy of Applied Physics that had grown organically from the conversation between Vasquez and the Sankei ambassador on the first day in the council chamber. She was 47 years old and completely in her element and regularly forgot to eat lunch. Tyler Brooks was promoted to lieutenant on his 25th birthday, which the crew of the Unbroken celebrated with exactly the kind of undignified party that military protocol technically discourages. He kept writing his log. He always would. Ben Holt was offered a position at the Naval War College designing dark matter tactical curriculum and turned it down because he wanted to stay on the Unbroken, and Sarah hadn't decided to leave and he saw no reason to go anywhere she wasn't. Rosa Martinez talked to the Drive Corps constantly, and the Drive Corps responded by running at 99.7% efficiency on every measurable metric, which Rosa considered validation of her approach and which the engineers assigned to audit the drive systems found inexplicable but also didn't argue with. James Okafor was promoted to lieutenant commander and married his partner on leave in Lagos and brought back a photograph that he put in the communication station frame where it stayed for the rest of his time on the ship. Dr. Amara Osei published the first comprehensive text on xenobiological first aid protocols, which became the standard reference for every human ship going into council space, and which was dedicated to the Unbroken's crew. Ambassador Greth Vaz of the Keth Dominion quietly requested a reassignment after the withdrawal and was posted to a remote administrative position far from the council chambers, which was, as far as anyone could tell, his own choice. He had said what he needed to say. He was done with the work that had needed doing. He went somewhere quiet. High Chancellor Vara served 2 more terms as Chancellor and spent a significant portion of both terms on the Developmental Zone Protocol revision, a process that eventually took 7 years and involved representatives from 46 civilizations and produced a document that was, by the standards of council lawmaking, both unusually specific and unusually honest about what it was correcting. Sarah Cole commanded the Unbroken for 6 more years after the Velther Prime session. She took it to 8 different star systems, participated in 4 separate council diplomatic missions, navigated 3 minor border disputes as a neutral party, and oversaw the first formal joint military exercise between the United Sol Fleet and a council member civilization, the Draxi Collective, who turned out to be excellent partners in anything that required careful planning and absolutely terrible partners in anything that required improvisation, which Sarah found very funny and also very useful to know. She was promoted to admiral at 44. She didn't particularly want to be an admiral. She wanted to command the Unbroken. But she understood, as she understood most things, that wanting was not the deciding factor, and that what was needed was what she had to offer. She passed command of the Unbroken to Ben Holt, who was the right choice, and both of them knew it. He stood on the bridge and looked at the viewport with an expression of deep and slightly pained satisfaction, and she thought, yes, good, it's his now, it was always going to be his eventually. She went to an office. She built things from the office, large and slow and important things, the kind of things that don't make the dramatic kind of news but matter in the way that foundations matter. She designed the framework for the United Sol Fleet's expansion to 24 ships. She drafted the protocols for humanity's first permanent presence at Velther Prime. She worked with Vasquez, who was 68 now and showed no signs of stopping, on the diplomatic architecture of a dozen bilateral relationships, each one different, each one requiring a specific understanding of who the other party was and what they needed and where the edges of possibility were. She was not afraid of the stars anymore. She had never been afraid of them exactly. What she had been afraid of was what they contained, the unknown distances, the unimaginable scales, the civilizations too old and powerful to see her clearly. She had been afraid of the wall. The wall was not gone. There were still old civilizations and vast distances and powers that did not yet see humanity clearly. There would be for a long time. Probably for as long as she lived. But the wall was no longer what it had been. It had a door in it now. A door that had been put there by 12 ships and 1 vote and 1 phrase that kept appearing in council documents and research papers and diplomatic communiques and the personal log of a young navigator from Portland. A SYMJHY. From this moment forward. On a quiet evening in the spring of 2169, Admiral Sarah Cole was in her office on Earth, working through a stack of council communication briefings that had accumulated while she was in a 2-day logistics meeting, when she received a personal transmission. It was from Marcus Webb. He rarely transmitted. He had, in his retirement, settled into a life of walks and reading and watching the ocean, and he communicated with people mostly when he ran into them or when something moved him enough to make the effort. She hadn't heard from him in 4 months. The transmission said, "Sarah, I was sitting outside this evening watching the stars come up. I don't know if you do that anymore, I suspect you're too busy. But I was watching them, and I was thinking about a night about 15 years ago when I sat in my office and looked at 31 papers and called Priya in and asked her to tell me I was wrong. And she couldn't. I was thinking about what it means that I did that. Not the physics, I mean the decision, the actual human decision to take something I'd been working on in private for years and say, this matters, this is the moment, this is what we do with it. I was thinking about how many times in history someone has had that moment and made the wrong call. Kept it private, given up, decided the cost was too high. I was thinking that the thing that made the difference for us wasn't just the physics. It was the people. You and your crew and Priya and Torres and Vasquez and all the people in all the facilities and ships and negotiating rooms. The physics was the door. You were the ones who walked through it. I wanted to tell you that I think about it, and that I'm glad it was you. Eat dinner. You probably forgot. Marcus. Sarah Cole read the message twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked out her office window at the evening sky. The stars were coming up the way they always did, the way they had for 4.5 billion years before any mind on this planet had looked at them and wondered. She thought about the unbroken. About KD-7 turning to vapor. About her mother's hand on the center console. About Tyler Brooks standing in the council gallery with wonder on his face. About Vara saying I'm sorry in the morning light on a world that was not Earth. About all of it. About the shape of it now that she could see the shape. Of SYMJHY. From this moment forward. She closed the transmission. She got up from her desk. She went and found her dinner, which she had in fact forgotten. She ate it at the window watching the stars come all the way out. They were beautiful. They had always been beautiful. The difference was that now, looking at them, she knew where several of them led. And she knew, with the specific, grounded certainty of someone who had been there and come back, that the people out there, around those stars, in those ancient chambers and distant worlds, had looked back. They had seen Earth. They had seen the ships that rose from grief and quiet fury and refused to stop. They had seen her people, Carol, and the stars remembered. The end.